Good morning, everyone. Kathy, thank you very much for that introduction. As she has said, my name is Linda Mthenjane, and I'm not alone. I'm here with my business partner, Andrew Roux, who will introduce himself shortly. So I guess when we look at why we're here today, we're really here to talk about that missing piece in graduate success, which for us, we believe is mental health. And what was quite interesting when we were thinking of how we're going to introduce ourselves to you is we have very similar stories, but on very different parts of the country. So I'm a clinical psychologist, I'm a serial entrepreneur, I'm a mother, a wife, a sister, and I guess most importantly, I'm a Black woman in South Africa, for whom it was very important that we have solutions that speak to our country. And if we roll up all of these roles that I play, they kind of converge into one of the key parts of who I am today, which is a mental health advocate. I have myself had experience with mental illness in my home, and that has gotten me to a point of understanding the importance of having early access, but preventative access where mental health is concerned. So getting mental health right for young South Africans is my purpose.
It was fun for Linda and myself. Thanks, Linda, to find these photographs of us at similar ages, with my little sister top right, and with my wife as graduates, and then with my family at the bottom. And it's not a space that I expected to be in. I am a qualified actuary and the financial director of the space between us, but through the last few years and journeying with my older two children, especially on their personal journey, just come to realize the huge need and impact of mental health. And it's just been so exciting to be part of this journey with Linda and trying to tackle it. Thanks, Linda. Over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. So together, both of us mental health advocates for similar and at times different reasons, we then formed the space between us. And I think the best way to explain the space between us is with this quote. And the quote says, "Our relationship lives in the space between us. It doesn't live in me or in you, or even in the dialogue between the two of us. It lives in the space that you and I share, and that space is sacred." So the name comes from wanting to create spaces in corporate South Africa, in South Africa at large, where young people are able to pick up mental health skills, where young people are able to be connected, to have relationships, and to preemptively work on their mental health. And the space between us is now 3 years old. In fact, in a week's time, it will be 3 years old. But as you can see from the gray hair, Andrew and I have been working for many, many years. And generally, when we work with young people, what we like to do is there are micro skills that we teach them. And one of the ones that we teach them is how to create space, not just between them and other people, but space inside themselves. Slow down, to become really mindful. As you walk into that presentation, as you walk into that meeting, how can you calm your insides? And I'm just wondering, certainly it's something that we do in our organization, that before we get into the next thing, we kind of create the space to, you almost separate what you were doing before. So whatever you were doing before now, a meeting, driving, etc. I'd like to invite you to just join us by doing what we call diaphragmatic breathing. And the essence of that is very much like babies, and they do it best. Instead of using your shoulders, you're actually truly using your diaphragm, so that every time you breathe out, Your stomach feels like it's blowing out like a balloon. You're taking air in and then you're breathing out. And what we find and what we know through research is that breathing, conscious breathing, is an antidote to stress, is an antidote to anxiety, and is an antidote to depression. I'm going to invite you as we enter the space together to just create the space, A, to listen, but B, to dialogue with us as we go through this journey. And I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. And if it's not comfortable to do that, I'm going to ask you to just look at one place and to perhaps put your right hand on your tummy and to put your left hand on your heart and just breathe in. Remember, when you breathe, you push your tummy out and then you breathe out. And do it 3 times. Last time. Thank you. Thank you for doing that. And just that calms me, knowing that I'm talking to 62 people. Makes me feel very calm to know that we've joined the space together. You feel that, Pindile. Thank you so much. Thank you for saying so. It always helps. So you may be asking yourself that besides being advocates and older entrepreneurs, what else qualifies us to have this conversation? Over the past 18 months, we have seen over 300 young people in our young professional program. And we've listened outside of what we know from the mentors that we've had over the years, who are largely young people. We have seen both male and female, as you can see, yes, largely Black, but young people between the ages of 24 and kind of 32, 34. And there are certain things that we know because of what we've seen. And there are 3 things that I want to share. But before I do that, perhaps just a thought. As psychologists, what we know is that half of the mental disorders you can see the brain dysfunction already at age 14 if you look at the scans. But most of it goes undetected. And the age group that the people in the room look after, so that age group in those early to mid-20s, that is when you actually, if you have a precipitating event, you have something that happens to you, this is when a mental illness can kick in. So if we look at the young people that we worked with, there are 3 things that we know for sure. One is that if you look at background, if you look at where people come from, if you really see the people that you're working with, rather than just the degree, the chances of you being able to influence them is high. So what we've seen is that it's not only in the time management that we send them to, it's not only in all the other beautiful development courses that we send them to. It is in making sure that when we are working with them, we are using the kinds of experiences that acknowledge where they are coming from. This is when we have transformative experiences and teaching with them. So seeing them, seeing the environments that shape them, using people who they can identify with, who understand where they come from, whether it be a township shack environment or a luscious suburb or anything between that. That context is very important in terms of how we work with young people. What we also know for sure is that these young people need the relationships. Right? Oh.
It's not updated.
No. It's all right. Yes, now it's there. So what we know for sure, so we all know that emotional connection among humans is like oxygen. Connection is like oxygen. And what we know is that creating relationships and spaces where young people can connect, where they can be touched positively, where they can be seen, means that we are creating stronger bonds for people to be able to work cross-functionally, for people to be able to work across departments. Because in those spaces that we create, they are able to be vulnerable. So we know how important this is to them. And the last thing that's been very clear to us working with young people is that unlike our generation, where mental health has much bigger stigma, for this generation, they wear their mental health and sometimes their mental illness on their sleeve. People talk about, I'm depressive. People are not afraid to speak up, which then means that they need organizations that, in fact, acknowledge their full self and are allowed, and they're allowed to show up at work as their full self. Right? So they need organizations, they demand organizations that take mental health seriously. So I'm going to pause there for a bit because I'd like to bring you into the conversation. I'm wondering about the kind of young people that you see. So my understanding is most of the people on this call look after young professionals. I'd like you to join me as we describe the kind of young leaders that are in your care. And I'm looking for characteristics. If somebody had to ask you, who are these people? What would you say? I'm going to ask you to take out your phone. And on your phone, we're using a product called Mthenjane. On your phone, if you could go to your browser, type in www.menti.com, and you use the code 3654-4362. You should see this slide. And really just by a show of hands and that sort of thing, the little icons, can I please see when you get there so that I know you're there? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, good people. I see you got it. So I've got 4 people who've responded. We've got at least 60 people in the room. Looking forward to getting a lot more.
They can put in more than one word. So.
Absolutely. Okay, so I see ambitious is one of the biggest ones that we've got going. I'm not sure how many people have had exposure to Mthenjane, but the bigger the word, the more people have used that particular word. So ambitious still runs as first in this race. Demanding is second. What you also have is, if you look back, you have young people who many have come through really difficult circumstances, but they have purpose and they have grit. And grit meaning passion and tenacity. They kept at it. So even those young people who are driven to St. Stephen's or Wendywood Primary, the ones that you have in your care largely have purpose and grit. They know what they want. Most of them highly intelligent. Most of them work very hard. They didn't give up. And what we know about them is that the main muscle, psychologically speaking, that they have built is one that says, I can get through this. They push, they push, they push. So the fact that they're demanding makes sense because they have worked hard to be here and they've gotten here by pushing, by being vocal, by being demanding, by being ambitious, right? What we also know about these young people is that they, for the most part, especially the crew of the cream that you pick up, right? A lot of them are not just loners. So many of them haven't really built good, strong relationships, partly because some of them have actually felt that they don't need them. They're focused on their school, they're focused on getting things right. The problem, of course, with that is that you also then have young people who are not just independent, but what we call anti-dependent, right? And anti-dependent really just talks to people who can do it themselves. But we all know, those of us who are a little bit older, that that actually isn't a reality. You can't do it on your own and by yourself. So this combination of I can think my way through it and I can do things myself and I must not fail and I shouldn't drop any of these glass balls that I'm busy carrying really calls for a unique kind of young person that we're talking about here. They have to come into a culture, though, that the corporate South Africa demands, which is a culture of networking and relationships and after work and having to perform in teams and work groups and having to ask for help. This is not something that they're used to doing because these are our brightest. They're the brightest of the bright. Right? So over and above the descriptions that you have given me, I want you to just think about these other descriptors as I walk through the 3 ingredients of mental health thinking that I think the young people need. These young people, and I want to end this piece with a quote. So these young people, I think, have done this. And I want to read this quote to you. It says, family dysfunction rolls down from generation to generation like a fire in the woods, taking down everything in its path. So one person in one generation has the courage to turn and face the flame. That person brings peace to their ancestors, spares the children that follow. That's what you have in these young people. Most of them first generation, some of them not first generation professional, but certainly first generation into fields that their families don't understand and know. Some of them first generation outside of being the usual lawyer in the family and being an actuary instead. Most of them having to face some sort of dysfunction that they have to carry. So one of the elements that the hairs at the back of my neck stand up when we talk about things like black tax. It's not black tax, but if you are the first or even the second, then there is a large group behind you. Yeah? So it becomes important that this is the context within which we look at these young people. So if we look at that, then what perhaps could be the 3 most important ingredients of mental health that we must be thinking about as we grow them, as we develop them, as we train them to be young leaders. And we would like to argue that these are the 3. One is we need to think about the traumatic context that these young people come from. And please hear me when I say trauma is not just people who grew up in the township. if you were touched, if you had a childhood, there's an element of trauma, and I'm going to talk about that. The second piece is we need to consider the kind of selves that they were able to build. So self is built by what you take in through all your senses, what you make of it, and then how you show up in the world. How did that happen for them? And then we need to consider how the brain works. Right? So let's just pull these three things apart. So if we look at the traumatic context, so we've got the big T, we all know about. The big T for South Africans is, of course, a trauma-infused history. It's a legacy of dismantling, especially the African family, which is where values are infused from. It's a legacy of disproportion. It's a legacy that has bred violence. Currently, it's a legacy of a failing state. For all of us, it's a legacy of the 3 years we've been through with COVID, right? And all of this has a certain potential to cause huge trauma. So what is trauma? Let's just pause and say, okay, so what is trauma? So trauma is it's actually the Greek word for wound. And by trauma, what I mean is, so first of all, trauma is subjective, right? What's traumatic to you may not be traumatic to me. But the essence of what trauma is about is that you experience something negative and it is overwhelming. And what your body does is, instead of processing it or dealing with it, it stores it inside of you. And what happens is you get into a loop around, if you even experience something small similar to that, it triggers it, and you have a 100 Rand reaction to a 10 cents problem, right? So there is the big T, which is the legacy of apartheid and everything that flows from it. And it's not just in 1960, it is transgenerational. We've seen the studies, whether from Nazi Germany, because we don't have too many in South Africa that we've done that are really good. It's transgeneration in the sense that even if you were not standing in front of a gun or being carried, the impact of it is felt many, many generations later in the body, right? So that's the big T, which is the context. And I'll tell you why this is important in how we train. The small t that's important is what we call covert trauma, right? So from this big T to the next is what is more the subtle thing. So if you're living in a context like that, and in South Africa, we know, when I talk about violence, I'm also talking about crime, I'm talking about all of that. So we're always in a state of readiness and awareness, but that's how this crew has grown up, that we're busy looking after, that we're growing to be leaders, right? So when we're talking about covert trauma, what we're talking about is relational largely. So how attuned were the relationships between parent and child? How taken care of were these young people, right? So one of the things that we're seeing as psychologists is a rise in what we're calling the borderline person, well, what the DSM calls the borderline personality disorder amongst young women. And that's born largely from abandonment issues, right? So between COVID trauma and the big T and the small t, if we're not considering how trauma impacts the individuals we're busy training, that we're working with, that we're developed to be leaders, this could be problematic. And let me show you why. If you look at our trauma responses, right? So something happens, and let's make it so simple. A presentation, we ask a young person to go in and make a presentation. They walk into the presentation and in their mind, they're all prepared. And as they're not seeing a single, right? And it could very well be that the people who they're talking to are just in the corner, absolutely innocent. That act feels like a threat response in a matter of minutes, matter of seconds. If it feels like a threat response, they will either stop and look angry, as if they're fighting the situation. They will freeze, or they will try and say things perhaps to now, which is not part of the presentation, but just to make the discomfort go away. Right? And when they stand back afterwards, they've left the presentation, they actually don't know why they did that. Right? I'll explain in the brain why they would have done that. Right? So if you look at these 4 trauma responses, the question I then have is, do we understand the kind of makeup that our young people have in terms of the trauma that they've experienced in the past, big or small, that can hinder their performance? Because if we don't understand that, then it becomes difficult to create the kind of growth paths and plans that are just generic, that are supposed to help them. So trauma as a context is very important. But the second context and the second ingredient that we have to consider when we're talking about mental health is understanding the self. And where do we begin with understanding the self? We start in the family. The way we were loved, the way we were held, the way we were listened to, this determines the kind of self that walks into the room when we're talking about young people. Now, if you were a young person who hardly had access to role models, who either walked to school or whose mom came in to look after someone else's child at 5 o'clock in the morning, or if you were driven at the back of that Merc and nobody ever spoke to you because we're listening to the news, we're on our phones, etc. Whatever informed your authentic self, you bring that into the workplace. It becomes a template for you on how you relate. So even though you are cognitively intelligent, you're self-sufficient, the question is, are you able to feel, or are you only able to use your cognition? If you can't feel into your body, then you can't slow yourself long enough to actually solve the things that happen to you on a daily basis. We've already said these are high achievers. We've already said that they're clever. We've already said, I saw in the cloud work, that they're perfectionists, right? So a lot of these young people that we work with, their identity is very intricately woven to performance. We have to try and decouple it so that their sense of self is controlled firstly from inside, but also it is just about them, as opposed to, I am good, I am worthy, I am lovable because I can perform. So if we don't understand that and we can't help them with that, then what we throw at them may not land, because instead what we may find is young people who, even though have achieved, self-doubt, right? This is what we talk about when we talk about the imposter syndrome. The imposter syndrome is largely a high achiever problem. It is not the losers, it's a high achiever problem. And we know that it disproportionately affects women and people of color. And a lot of it is just that. It's about helping them understand the self and providing them with the correct skill set, so that if they feel that their world is controlled from inside, then they can do the rest in terms of what you want them to do in the workplace. So understanding the self is important. The third key ingredient is the brain. And this I absolutely, obviously as a psychologist, find absolutely fascinating. And I'm just briefly going to explain three structures too. We all know brain, complex organ. But there are three pieces that I do want to explain to you because they affect our sense of well-being. So if you look at that, little orange piece in the front, right? Right in the front, it's called the prefrontal cortex. And this is the piece, if this piece is on, then we are acting as adults, right? This is our best self. This is us stopping and thinking and analyzing. Truly, this is us as adults, right? That's that front piece. But that front piece is the last to grow, is the last to develop to its fullest potential. It is only fully developed once we're 25. What comes first, if you've had a baby, you will know this, or if you've seen baby scans, what comes first is that one that is like a little stick. So that brainstem, right? That one comes first. And the brainstem or the limbic system is really just about helping us with everything that we don't have to think about. What I'm really interested in is the piece inside that brainstem, that little piece called the amygdala. Right? The amygdala is probably one of the most primitive of our brain. That's the one that affects our perception, and that's the one that is our threat response. It tells us whether or not we are in danger, right? And what does danger look like? And for me, it's best explained, again, let's go back to the young person making a presentation. It is in the snicker, it is in the look that the amygdala is very quickly, because it works millimeters of a second. It is in that we respond, right? And if our trauma is around bullying, for instance, in the workplace, just that snicker in the corner sets us off. It destabilizes us, right? And here we then say to the young person, no, but we're taking you to presentation skills and all of these things. How come you're not coming around, right? It's because, don't blame them, blame their amygdala. Their amygdala has said to them, they're not safe in this environment, right? So if they're not safe, what the brain's going to do is shoot cortisol, adrenaline, and then remember the four stress responses? They're going to respond, even without meaning to respond. So it becomes important for young people to be able to understand this. So even though what is laid down was laid down many, many years ago, we are able to learn new behaviors, to have our neural pathways fire differently, right? Because we know that there's something called neuroplasticity, which means that we actually, with each new behavior, the frequency of mental health habits and skills that are different from before, we don't just react. We won't just react. We will start doing things differently, right? But our young people need to understand that. We need to understand that in how we are developing and training them. We need to understand how the brain works. So the question then becomes, how do we intervene with young people? So for me, this quote is an important one, because when we're talking about things like mental health skills, and we're talking about slowing people down, making you intentional, self-compassion, then the most potent medicine is this ancient commitment to never abandon yourself, to discover wholeness in the whole mess, to be a loving mother to your insides, to hold the broken bits in open awareness, to illuminate the sore places with the light of love. And this is not, what do they call it, apple pie and humble, this, that, and the other. It's not. The ability for young people to understand themselves, to understand their brain, to understand self-compassion is what then makes them good at the technical skills that you're asking them to perform. So what do they need? So to our minds, this is what they need. We think they need to have an authentic sense of self, which means digging into your self-esteem. which means digging into your background and getting to understand how you were esteemed. We think that they need proper relational skills, don't we all? Because we're not a very relational society. We think that beyond the grit that they have, this determination that they have, they need to be taught to bounce back and forth, to be resilient. We think that as young South Africans, they need to understand how race plays a role in who they are in the workplace. And then they need the kind of pulling together integrative mental health skills that they have in their pocket as a journey. The tools help them on their way. So it's not a once-off conversation. It's a conversation that they have to constantly have. But if it's missing in the way that we're developing them, then we're missing the plot as HR professionals. So the question then becomes, are we the only ones thinking like this? And I would argue not. So what I'm going to ask Andrew to do is give us a sense of what the rest of the world is saying about what we've seen, not just as a space between us, but certainly as psychologists in South Africa on what is important for young people.
Thank you, Lina. Always good to hear you talk about these topics that we are so passionate about. Love this quote saying that if we can reframe so that we look at mental health much more like taking vitamins rather than aspirin, how can we be proactive and as we've been saying, add that missing ingredient to the way that we look at people. But I want to start with another round of Menti, so if you'll take your phones out again and answer this question for me. Oops, before I give you what I think the answer should be. What is it that graduates want from an employer? Let's see how many responses we'll get this time answering that question. Are you guys finding the question there? Let me just see whether Menti is up and running. The code is 3654 4362. So just put that in at menti.com. I'm not seeing the responses coming through, just looking at my own phone. I see that it's asking you for 3, but you don't need to, you can only give us 1 if you want. Is it working there, Linda?
Working on my side.
Okay, so it looks like, oh, there you go. I needed to press, okay. Oh. Sorry, it was there, but not showing us. So yeah, it's coming through. Thank you very much. We've got 33 people who have submitted, and support, growth and development are coming through at the top. Interesting opportunities and recognition. I'm seeing flexibility come through. We'll give a few more minutes for more people to put in their answers. Thank you for those who have submitted already. I think the answer to this question is already quite different to what it was 25 years ago when I came into the workplace. Or was it 30? It's closer to 30, to be honest, in the spirit of transparency. So it looks like I need to click every time for it to update. But we've now got 40 people and 90 answers. Thank you. So development, growth, and support continue to be the big items coming through. Flexibility and work-life balance is an interesting one. I'm not sure that we would have given that the same amount of airtime 5 years ago as we know that we need to now. Leadership recognition, transparency. I like that. I think that's really important. Thank you. So I think I'm going to move on. I found this an incredibly helpful framework to think about this. It comes from the Harvard Business Review. You can see the authors there earlier this year. Very happy to share this article with anybody. My email address will come up a bit later. But just to help us to really think broadly enough and widely enough about what we offer to employees for them to be successful. We know what the company wants from them in terms of being effective, being productive, hitting the ground running, being creative, working in teams. But what is it that we can plow into them? And this sort of 2 dimensions of looking at what they individual experiences in the short term versus the long term, and what do they experience on their own versus as part of a collective, I think is helpful. So in the top left, the material stuff, it is obviously compensation and bonuses. It also goes into the flexibility around work practices. It goes to the quality of the laptop that we give them. Those are the material things that I experience in the short term. But what I also want to experience in the longer term for myself is the growth and development. It's all of the opportunities that I get to develop new skills that make me feel like my career is going somewhere, even if it's not at this company. And I want to feel that the company is really interested in my growth and development. Also in the longer term, but now moving to the things that I don't experience all by myself, but being part of a bigger collective, is this area of meaning and purpose. And I think especially for the generation that's coming into the workplace now, that sense of being part of something that makes a difference, knowing what the role of this company is in the world and what contribution it's making and how my role fits into that, which is very much something that I experience together with my colleagues. And then very importantly, in the area that we really want to focus on is this area of connection and community, which is what I experience right now, but I don't feel it all by myself. Am I feeling connected into the organization? There was some research that was done on college students recently, where they were asked what would they miss if they work remotely rather than in the office. And 74% cited that online or that office community element of interacting with other people. 41 said mentoring, which is the other thing that is much harder to do when one is not in person together. In the early part of 2020, research was done with Microsoft employees in the US, 61,000 of them. And it was found that working remotely immediately led to a more siloed existence and much reduced collaboration. And that's for people who already before COVID had built relationships. They had the opportunity to get to know people. So if new people come into the organization, into a remote working environment, this element of connection and community, we're going to have to just look at very carefully to make sure that it's there, which connects with the idea of team psychological safety. If I feel that I belong to a community and that I'm connected in, and that it's okay for me to take risks, to express my ideas and concerns, to speak up with questions, to admit mistakes without worrying about negative consequences. Those are all the results of feeling like I'm in community with other people. Emotions like trust, curiosity, confidence, and inspiration come with that feeling of I've got people around me, all the way to creativity and open-mindedness and just that sense of positive and being part of a team that is there to support me rather than that is going to take me out at the knees when I make a mistake. So I think a very powerful model to help us think more broadly. to make sure that we cover all of the bases, and you will see the connections also with what Linda was talking about in terms of the growth and development and investing in people's skills, all the way to feeling that sense of community. The other piece of research that we've come across was done by a company called Headspace in partnership with Dimensional Research. It's their 5th annual Workforce Attitudes Towards Mental Health report that came out literally a couple of weeks ago. And there are 4 key insights from that research that I want to share with you, together with the ideas that were offered in terms of what to do about it. And the first is, we've all been through a lot. Linda spoke about the fact that it's not just the big T traumas, but these smaller T's, all the way from COVID and transitioning to a totally new way of work. In South Africa, we had floods and we had riots. And then on top of that, the world economy has gone into a nosedive, and there's war in Ukraine, and we've got load shedding to deal with. And so this sense of dread, this feeling every now and again of just saying, this is just not working. And for me, to be honest, it comes when I see that there's not 2, but 4 hours of load shedding. And I just sort of have this real guttural sort of emotional response to that. And we all go through it. And it's important for us to, I think, acknowledge how frequent that is. 49%, according to the research, of people feel at least once a week this sort of overwhelming sense of dread. At senior management levels, 55%, at CEO level, 59%. So it is part of the reality, and there's this cumulative effect after what we've been through in the last few years. And if we're not going to acknowledge that, if we're not going to allow people to be real and to bring that into the workplace, there's effectively a landmine there waiting to trip us up. The second point coming from the Headspace research is about the importance of work around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And we might use different words in the South African context to describe these, but it is really important to acknowledge the intersectionality of mental health. It is in our mental health that all of these external influences, from what we see in the news, what we see in social media, what we experience in the workplace, and what we brought with us from our past, come together. And a business culture that doesn't expect people to be sort of clinical machines, but to be human beings, to bring my whole self into the workplace. My ability to create spaces for my team to have real conversations, whether that is about minority groups and how we handle diversity in the workplace, so that those who are in the minority feel really supported in the workplace, but also just the ability to have tough conversations about other things, and to make sure that we do that with consistency and with authenticity. There's nothing worse than for the boss to say, when we're all at Mulder's Drift at a team building, how wonderful it is to be caring and all of those things. And in the moment that the chips are down and the results are not coming, then that is just lost. I think that loses all sense of belief and authenticity. So we've got to make sure that these things really become part of the culture, and that we create the time to have those conversations. The third insight from the Headspace research, I'm sure that there's nobody on this call that's going to disagree with, and that is the importance of looking after our human resources leaders. And the concept that Lena and I have encountered in the work that we've done with companies is the sense that the HR is like the first responders, like ambulance staff and other emergency staff, the first people on the scene at a trauma, and the ones that need to keep on be helping and supporting and giving, and forgetting to look after themselves. For me, it's very helpful to think of emotional energy and psychological energy as limited a resource as money is. So with money, we plan and we budget, and we know that there's a point where it comes to an end. So we've got to make choices to work with what we've got. But somehow, I think we try to see our emotional energy and our ability to just keep and giving and supporting others as an unlimited resource, and not look after our own support, self-care, finding spaces to share with teammates, and to share the load. That graph at the bottom, I think, is quite scary, that even though human resource leaders are the ones who put these facilities in place to support people the employee wellness facilities, it's often HR that make use of it the least for their own purposes, even though we know that it is really important. So I think a very important part of what we see as the ecosystem around these young professionals, because the HR team is such an important resource to them. Then the last element of the or insight from the Headspace research is around the way that CEOs are engaging with the times that we're going through. And I think on the positive side at the bottom, you can see that there is an increased openness to talking about mental health. I think through COVID, we've all given up pretending that it doesn't exist. I think there's much more openness. But unfortunately, on the top right, a lot of leaders, almost half of them in this research, still feeling like their job is to always be positive and just paint a positive picture, almost irrespective of what's going on, which doesn't connect with authentically with what people are really experiencing in themselves and what we're seeing in the world around them. And we really believe instead of that, to create a space where we can really have authentic conversations, where people can hear from leadership what is happening in the company, what the impact is of what's happening in the wider world on the company, and ask questions and hear leaders also with vulnerability sharing their own ups and downs, creates much more continuity and the sustainability into the future, because it just feels real and in touch with what I'm experiencing for myself as well. So we found it very exciting to see that also from research across the world that other people are seeing the importance of this work. And as we've been saying, that this is a critical ingredient to the journey that we take people on from our own experience. As I said, the human resources staff and line managers are a critical part of the support structure around young professionals. And it's important to make the time to ensure that line managers understand what mental health is, how the brain works, and all of these things, help them and train them with the skills to intervene. A whole bunch of things that one can talk about, but things like identifying a team member who is struggling. What does it look like? How can I have an emotionally safe conversation? How can I make sure that they're aware of the resources at their disposal? The World Health Organization mapped out 10 psychosocial risks to mental health in terms of how organizations are structured and the practices in the company to make sure that we address people as individual as well as group beings. And then the very tough conversation around balancing. If somebody in a team is struggling with mental illness, that person's care with the rest of the team that need to pick up extra work and need to also go through their own emotions in that situation. So these are very practical skills that we think that can also help to bring mental health in a positive and constructive way into the workplace. For human resources staff, again, understanding what mental health is, some of the content that Linda shared with us today, understanding what it looks like in the workplace, how is it likely to manifest itself. We've spoken a little bit about the self-care and the risk of compassion fatigue, where you're just handing out and not looking after yourself. Building supporting communities around where there's a space where you can just go and vent or ask for ideas or share some of the ways that we're managing all of these challenges. And then just a bunch of really practical micro skills, whether it is active listening, whether it is knowing how to respond when people come to you with really tough personal situations, how to give constructive feedback. These are things that we think we know how to do, but there's real science, and if we can create the space for people to learn how to do that at an excellent level, that is going to help us to support our people even more. So this is the key question. Apologies that we lost Linda there. She is still here, I can promise you, because she's sitting a meter away from me. And this is the challenge that we wanted to leave the group with, whether we as HR professionals really are doing enough, not from just a company perspective, but from a national perspective to grow future leaders. It's been great to talk to everybody, and we'd love to hear some questions. you can just raise your hand and ask. We'll look at the chat. But the last or the third option is to go back to using Menti again. So any of those ways, and Linda is sitting here, so even if we can't see her, we'll be able to also hear her thoughts. So we'd love to just take the next 20 minutes, 25 minutes that we've got left to answer any questions that there are.
Andrew, I'll check if there are questions.
Kamen is asking for the slide of what we need to focus on. Let me just check with which one you are referring to. Is that the one for HR or the employee value proposition? Is it this one? Looks like this is the one that Kamen wanted to see. Any other questions?
Please feel free to ask your questions either in the chat or on Mentimeter.
I just want to go back to the Menti slide so I can just see if there are any questions coming through there. Otherwise, welcome to put up your hand and we could just... All right. So Linda, here's a question. What is the general sense of what companies are doing to support HR people?
Right. Can you hear me now?
Can you guys hear Linda?
Yes, we can hear. I can hear her.
So let me know if you can't hear me by some sort of...
I think we're getting thumbs up, so I'm assuming that's...
All right. So, you know, as an ex-HR executive, I am a little bit disheartened because I think for the most part, as Andrew has said, our view is human resource professionals are the first port of call. So there is a level of secondary traumatization that happens with them as people come and speak to them, but there isn't a lot in terms of actual support that we have seen. Obviously, there are wellness providers that each organization has. What was interesting, certainly from the American research, was to see that we as HR practitioners don't really take those services in. But I'm not seeing purposeful support towards HR, and I think it's critical. It's probably one of the most important elements in supporting the ecosystem.
There's a question on the chat. Apart from support through ICAS and our wellness providers, is there any ideas on how we can assist with coping mechanisms?
Yes.
From Renee. Thanks, Renee.
Renee, training would be the first thing. So if we could train human resource practitioners on how to deal with things like compassion fatigue, if we could, first of all, just train them and retrain on the micro skills. So often people say, oh, but we do this, we do the active listening, we do the validation, etc. But I think because you have workplaces that have a heightened sense of needing more, we need to sharpen our micro skills and our ability to engage as human resource practitioners. So for me, it's training. Training would be it, but also providing support networks and support groups, such as the ones that are put forward by SAGEA. That would be another practical idea of how we can support HR practitioners.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I would just add is creating the space where we can just share the load with each other. When you feel that you're the only one going through things and you're not sort of comparing notes with your friends and colleagues who are going through the same thing, it feel a lot bigger. We've got a question here: can coaching be used as an effective way to support mental health and wellness? I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
Maybe as a new coach, you should answer that. But yes. Yes. So coaching as a process is really effective in supporting one-on-one. Of course, one can also do team coaching, but I think it's important for coaches, if they are not psychologists, when we're talking about mental health, to have a fairly good understanding of the mental health elements of functioning, of performance, for them to be effective in relation to mental health, right? But coaching as a process, whether it's individual or team, yes, absolutely can be used too.
Thanks, Linda. Anybody else? We're not seeing if anybody has the courage to put up a hand and ask a question. Anything else that you'd like to comment on, observations? Oh, we've got questions, and I didn't click again. Okay, so let me go. One of the biggest challenges that we're experiencing with our recent grads is resilience in the workplace. How could we as employers support them?
Help me understand by typing again what you mean by the problem is resilience. What does that mean? So that I can perhaps have a better sense of how to respond. And let me go to the next one. So while you're busy typing, just so I have a better sense of what you mean. Nothing expected to super. Is that a related response? Nothing?
No,
okay, so that's something else. Okay. Tools can we grab to acknowledge something? So as HR practitioners specifically, the ability to identify when somebody is actually walking down the path towards an injury where your mental health is concerned is part of what we do from a training perspective. So you absolutely can get tools and skills on how to identify. But I think what's most important, even before we get to injury, is to have young professionals understand for themselves what are some of the preemptive skills that they need. So before there's an issue, before you're walking towards injury, what are some of the preemptive skills that you need to actually help you not get there? So one of them, for instance, is, the breathing that I spoke about earlier on. Another one is truly understanding yourself and being very in touch with your physical being, because if you understand, for instance, the way you're feeling and what that means in terms of your internal state, and you understand how the brain works, then you're able to slow yourself down long enough to respond rather than react in a situation. So it's a combination of preventive skills that I think young people need, so that they don't even walk into the kind of so-called issues. But once they're already walking towards mental injury, then as HR professionals, the ability to actually identify that, and as line managers, the ability to support that.
So a little bit from the actuary, the way I try to think of it, which is my sort of abstraction, is we need to take people first to awareness. If we don't even understand that there's stuff that's happening in my brain that relates to how my dad interacted with me, I've got no way of managing it. So awareness. From that awareness, you can go to a deeper understanding, so that when somebody in a meeting responds to me in a certain way, over time, I can get to an understanding of what that is triggering in me. It doesn't make it easy, but I can at least have that understanding. And then build on top of that the skills, and those skills that with practice become habits and become a lifestyle. And so that's kind of in my mind. I don't know if that is helpful. The process, we've seen that if you just go straight into, okay, so this is what you need to build in your life. When people don't have the understanding of what's really this stuff happening in my brain that I need to understand. So it is a bit of a process that we also need to go through. I think the person on resilience has responded there.
Yeah. So Camille, I'm busy. Yeah, I'm busy trying to respond to someone else on the chat. I'm going to move this aside. I'll come back to responding to the direct question. So what I mean by resilience is working through challenges, working on multiple tasks and keeping deadlines, receiving constructive feedback, recovering. I see. So how can we support, how could we as employers support them? I think the most profound way you can support them is by providing them with the skills to manage, right? Because I guess our view of this is whatever they bring from their background is going to impact on all of the stuff that you're wanting them to do, the multiple tasking, the ability to keep deadlines, properly receiving feedback. Because let me just take the constructive feedback one. Part of why I don't hear you is not, it could be the way you're talking to me, it could be your tone, but it could also be because of what's in me and what I don't understand triggers me about how I hear you. So if I can train the person to understand how to receive by identifying what it is about what the person is saying triggers me, then you are able to have people listen as opposed to react. So you're able to take stuff in, breathe, and then respond. So if I just take that as an example, so the answer to my mind is preemptive skills. And what the preemptive skills would do would be, whether you're training HR or training the actual individuals, it would be that you would be able to be in touch with what is going on with long enough to be able to perform the tasks that you want the person to do. And when you're talking, for instance, about things like recovering from mistakes, when we understand what, okay, so if you understand the young person and they're never having failed, their perfectionistic nature, their need not to fail. If we have all of that understanding and they have all of that understanding, then it's easier to provide them with skills around things like self-compassion, for instance, where when you make a mistake, it is humane rather than inside of you, something that is wrong and incorrect and irretrievably, which is actually where people go when they're making a mistake. And this is why they can't recover from mistake. So the ability to train someone to understand what's going on for them is what part of the preemptive skills are about. So that would really help solve that problem. So we take them to resilience training as HR professionals, and we teach them big skill sets. But what we're arguing here is you got to hone in and focus on the individual first and how they're functioning. And only then can they then pick up the skill to actually be resilient.
There's a question on the Q&A from Halima. Our graduates' emotions seem to flare up close to exam time. Is there a quick tool on hand for someone to having a panic attack or feeling overwhelmed, like the breathing exercise that we did?
Yes. In fact, one of us, the psychologists that we work with, is a lecturer at WITS, and we ran specifically for actuaries that were about to write exams, how to deal not just with exam pressure and exam anxiety, stress, but how to recover if you actually don't pass. So there are tools, breathing is one, understanding what's at stake for that individual is another, and then trying to help them decouple what is at stake versus what they actually need to be doing in the short term. So again, it's a lot of kind of decoupling things because there's a lot of associations that make us not be able to function appropriately. Our ability to decouple it and declutter it helps us see things a lot more clearly. So the answer is yes.
And just to go into what Artie has said on the chat, would you suggest that different stakeholders in these grades engaged with should also be trained and upskilled to better manage these kinds of situations? I believe a more holistic understanding within an organization will help to allow grads to identify and work through some of the issues. And then Mthenjane said that she thinks that's a great idea, since the managers or leaders that these grads engage with come from different generations with a very different set of work values and background. And in that engagement, they also need some of that training.
Yes, I mean, that's something, yeah.
That's really what we were saying, that
Yeah.
it is the individuals, it's individuals looking back.
Yeah.
It's the individuals learning skills today to take them forward, but they are part of an ecosystem.
Yeah.
And the people that they interact with can either positively invest in them and help them along their journey, or they could be adding more little traumas on top of what they've experienced in the past, which would really be sad if we in the business world are injuring people more rather than being part of helping to create a space where they can heal and set themselves up for the amazing career that should be ahead of them. We are trying to monitor all platforms. You're really testing this ability to multitask here.
There's one from Zandi, resilience training might be a value. Have we done that one?
Yes.
There's a second one.
There's a second one. I didn't see that. More time for training. It's also appreciated. Maybe a value and more time to training. No, absolutely. Yes, it is. You're right. It is a two-way. As I was saying, that it is about tone and delivery, etc. But it's about where it's landing as well. So if you have not been exposed to emotional self-regulation, for instance, then delivery and tone actually of the person who's speaking to you is going to be secondary to the fact that anything that isn't an A+ is going to make you unhappy, and it's going to rile you. So absolutely, Zandile, it's delivery, tone, but very much what's inside you as a human being that you need to be understanding as a graduate.
And certainly that gels with my 30 years of experience. There's always two people in every engagement, isn't there? And then there's work to be done on both sides, and both sides can play their part to making that a wholesome and a constructive engagement, and both can take it down another path. I was saying to Linda that I as we moved down from Joburg to Cape Town, found an old file of performance appraisals, and I now realize that some of the things that people were irritatingly saying to me at every performance appraisal about how I'm engaging other people might actually have been true. At the time, I just couldn't understand or believe it. So maybe I needed a bit more of this training. Anything else?
I think we've got it all, hopefully.
Thanks.
Yeah, we have.
Thank you.
Andrew, Linda, thanks very much. That was a really, really interesting conversation. I must admit, I had a couple of issues in the first 20 minutes with load shedding and generators not kicking in. So I lost a bit of the thing, but I hope my team said that the recording did carry on. But what we will do, if anybody else faced any kind of dilemmas with trying to access the whole talk, we will get our wonderful videographer to stitch it all together and make sure that it's all coherent, makes sense, and get it up online in our resources section, so that if you want to revisit particular sections of the discussion, I will cut Linda out when she was blabbering away and nobody was hearing her too. How often does that happen? It really is. It's challenges we sit with every day. You know, you're on mute, but that was really, really helpful. Thank you so much. There are some comments coming through. Thank you so much, Linda, Andrew. So useful. And you know, I think we've got people across the whole value chain that work with us, you know, work with our young professionals, from, you know, people working. I mean, we've even got colleagues on the line who work with high school students. We've got colleagues who work with university students. you know, whether they are academics, whether they are in psychosocial support, whether they're in career development, and then through to our employers, you know, who have attraction and development, you know, responsibilities within their organization. And, you know, also being able to spot and understand students, because, you know, the first couple of years of work are very, very difficult. You just, you know, even if you have family who worked in that thing, the context is just so difficult. So thank you so much for that. And Linda and Andrew, I hope you'll be joining us at the next SAGEA engagement, so that you can get to meet some of our members in person and get to talk to them more. Colleagues, just to remind you, we are doing an in-person event. Yay, I'm so excited. The week of the 19th, we will be doing a roadshow, starting with Cape Town on the 20th at Harsendal in Brackenfell, I think it's area. Then we will do Durban on the 21st, and then Johannesburg on the 22nd, where we'll be sharing with you the latest trends and insights into what's happening in the graduate recruitment and selection space, but also getting to hear a lot from our class of 2022 who have recently joined the world of work, and their reflections on how they've pursued their access to the world of work and what they perceive good looks like, etc., etc. So always a very exciting presentation that we do mid-year, where Tim Wise, our research director, flies out from the UK. So we hope to see you, as many of you, in person as possible. And thank you very much. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Andrew.